In Windsor in 1648, Cromwell and the Army High Command held a prayer meeting to decide what to do about the king. Seeking guidance from the Bible, they found what they needed in the Book of Numbers.
For blood it defileth the land, and the land cannot be cleansed of the blood that is shed therein, but by the blood of him that shed it.
For the army leaders, this passage aptly fitted the conduct of the king, now their prisoner on the Isle of Wight. Charles, having once plunged the country into war, was plotting to do it again. In a secret deal, he persuaded the Scots to invade. In return, he promised to make the Scottish model of Presbyterianism the national church in England. There was consensus among the officers at Windsor. Their defeat of the king revealed that God supported their cause. By starting a second war, Charles was acting in defiance of God's will.
With God's guidance, we've come to a clear and joint resolution. It is our duty to call that man of blood, Charles Stuart, to account for the blood he has shed and for the mischief he has done to God's cause and to the poor people of these nations.
The army had made its intention clear. If the king's plan to regain the throne failed, he could expect little mercy. The Second Civil War lasted 6 months and was disastrous for the king. The Royalists and their Scottish allies were easily defeated by the highly professional New Model Army. The king's defeat brought no settlement to the hard-pressed country. But the war did serve to unite the army again. For the time being, soldiers put aside their grievances with their commanders. They had other reasons to be angry. Another 6,000 lives had been lost. Army and Parliament were still at loggerheads, and everyone knew that the future of the country still depended on one man. Now the big question was what should be done with the king. It split Parliament in two. The Presbyterian MPs, the majority, wanted to continue negotiations. They hoped to do a deal with the king and disband the army. Cromwell and his supporters believed that only by eliminating the king could they secure a lasting peace. It was political stalemate, a stalemate that force would now resolve. On the 6th of December 1648, Colonel Thomas Pride and a party of soldiers arrived at the doors to the chamber of the House of Commons. The revolution had come full circle.
Stand aside! Make way for the king!
6 years earlier, the king had used force against Parliament. Now it was the army's turn.
Your name, sir? Robinson. No. What do you mean, no? No. Stand aside.
Step back, sir!
Pride turned away 143 MPs, Presbyterians who wanted to restore the king. Only those who would do the army's bidding were let in. England was rapidly becoming a military state. The most powerful man in the army was now the most powerful man in the country. Oliver Cromwell.
Cromwell is moulding the army to his mind, filling it with his allies, weeding out the honest and honourable men and replacing them with turncoats and drunkards and men who swallow anything without question. Few can see it, and those that can dare not speak out. My husband fears that if it goes unchecked, Cromwell's ambition will destroy the cause and everything that has been achieved. Out of friendship, he went to visit Cromwell, though he made a great show of listening and made promises for the future. But John knew, even as Cromwell took him in his arms to embrace him, that he resented it. Ambition has ulcerated Cromwell's heart.
With Parliament purged, the army was free to do what it wanted with the king. It organised an elaborate show trial, Over 100 judges were called, all of them already convinced of the king's guilt. The president of the court was a little-known lawyer called John Bradshaw. The king was held in his old palace in Whitehall, where he was treated as an ordinary prisoner.
They treat the king with more rudeness and barbarity than before. They allow no one to see him, and only the soldiers who guard him to speak to him. These men sit up all night in his bedchamber, treating it like a guardroom, smoking and drinking. He is never allowed to leave the room, either to say his prayers or to receive the ordinary benefits of nature. This he must perform in their presence.
John Lilburne was equally dismayed, but for a different reason. He believed that whatever his crimes, the king was entitled to a fair trial in a court set up by a properly elected parliament.
This is a pretend parliament. In fact, this is no parliament at all. A mock parliament and a mock power. The people in it are traitors to their country. We must oppose Parliament's intention to try the king until a new, unquestionably representative Parliament is elected.
The trial was a public relations disaster. Some of the judges feared a violent royalist reaction. The president of the court even wore a bulletproof hat. The king refused to plead, saying the court had no right to try him. After 7 days, the judges unanimously found the king guilty. Cromwell made sure there were no waverers. On the 27th of January, 1649, President of the Court John Bradshaw read out the verdict.
The unanimous verdict of the court is as follows. Charles Stuart is tyrant, traitor, murderer and public enemy to the good people of this nation, shall be put to death by the severing of his head from his body.
When the king was summoned to hear his sentence, he asked to speak to the court. He was refused. For the sake of justice, I should be heard, he protested, but Bradshaw again refused and ordered him removed. Charles Stuart still believed he was king by divine right, but now soldiers humiliatingly manhandled him from Westminster Hall. 10 years earlier, they wouldn't have dared speak in his presence. Some soldiers spat at the king, others jeered. Three days later, on the 30th of January, King Charles was executed in Whitehall.
It is the most execrable murder that was ever committed. He was the worthiest gentleman, the best master, the best friend, the best husband, the best father, the best Christian this age has produced. And if he were not the best king, if he lacked certain qualities which have made some other kings great, then would be a happy prince who had half his virtues and gifts and were as free from any vice.
The king has been executed. My husband was one of those to sign the warrant. No man was compelled to sign. Some were too afraid. But John knew he had a responsibility to his country. If the king lived, then the bloodshed would continue. But to kill the king, that is an extraordinary thing.
The king's execution solved nothing. War had exhausted the country. There were widespread food shortages. The monarchy and the House of Lords had been abolished, but government was no more representative now than before. For John Lilburne, the Leveller leader, killing Charles was an empty gesture. For years he had campaigned for tolerance and social justice. The high point was Putney. There soldiers, inspired by his ideas, argued to their officers that the vote was an Englishman's birthright. Lilburne's writings had spread throughout the army. One contemporary said, "The soldiers quote his books like statute law. The whole army is one Lilburne throughout." Lilburne made no secret of his anger at what was happening in the country.
Cromwell's plan is to keep the poor in bondage forever, slaves, and with the help of a parliament that is putrefied. Force is the only power in England now, and the just and moral acts carried out by a troop of horse is the only law.
Many in the army shared Lilburne's anger. 3 months after the king's execution, the first of several mutinies took place here.
Captain went up to Elijah, who was sitting on the top of the hill.
It was led by a trooper named Robert Lockyer, a Leveller sympathiser.
Elijah answered the captain, "As I am a man of God, may fire consume."
These men, once soldiers in a crack regiment in the new model army, were now mutineers, barricaded in the Bull Inn after seizing the regiment's colours from their captain.
We fought for these colours as well as he. Listen, I served Parliament these 6 years. I was at Naseby, Langport, Banbury, the siege of Worcester, Maidstone and the siege of Colchester. The army owes me £84, 15 shillings and 6 pence.
2 things triggered the mutiny: the problem of back pay and the prospect of fighting a war in Ireland. But something deeper was at work. Lilburne's ideas had a profound impact on these troopers. They were now hugely disillusioned with their high command, so they waited anxiously for the army's response to their disobedience. It was swift and uncompromising. Cromwell arrived at the Bull Inn with a troop of soldiers. He refused to negotiate. The mutineers were quickly arrested, and Lockyer, the ringleader, was sentenced to death. Robert Lockyer's execution took place 3 days later in St. Paul's churchyard. It was a symbolic moment. Lockyer had joined the army at 16 and spent the last 7 years fighting for the Puritan cause. Brave, devout and loyal, he was a soldier after Cromwell's heart. But now this model trooper had turned against his officers, his hopes cruelly shattered.
I did not think you had such barbarous and heathenish opinions in you as to obey your officers in the murdering of me. I stand for nothing but your good. Do not look upon this as a discouragement, but rather an encouragement. For never man died more comfortably than I do. Present your pieces! Give! Fire!
Lockyer met a brave death, regretting only that he died over a pay dispute rather than the liberties of the nation he had fought so long for. 4,000 mourners attended his funeral. Within months, more Leveller-inspired mutinies broke out, again triggered by orders to fight in Ireland. In May 1649, 1,200 mutineers from various regiments reached the village of Burford. They bedded down for the night in the inns and houses along the main street. But Cromwell was in hot pursuit. With a loyal force of soldiers, he stormed into the town, catching the mutineers by surprise. There was little resistance. "340 mutineers were captured and locked in Burford Church. Here they spent 3 anxious days and nights awaiting the results of a court-martial. One of them scratched his name in the lead rim of the font. You can just see it. Anthony Sedgley, 1649, prisoner." On the morning of May the 17th, the mutineers were ordered onto the church roof to witness the execution of 3 of their colleagues. They were shot in the churchyard below. The execution of the 3 soldiers broke the spirit of the Levellers. It was the end of their dream of free speech, a freely elected government, and justice for all. Cromwell's crushing victory confirmed his status as the most powerful man in the country. In 3 years, he would effectively become military dictator. Lilburne watched these events from a prison cell. He was once again in jail for writing a pamphlet critical of the new regime. He despaired of achieving a government based on the will of the people, and his disillusionment with Cromwell was complete.
I don't know what they intend to do to me. I don't much care. We all have to die, and I, for one, would rather die fighting for my liberty than in my bed. But I'll tell you this. I would rather live 7 years under the old king's government when it was at its worst than 1 year under this government. We were ruled before by a king, lords and commons. Now it's a general, court-martial and commons. Pray tell me what the difference is.
"4 years after Burford, Cromwell disbanded Parliament and became Lord Protector, king in all but name. He died in 1658, and 2 years later Charles II returned to the throne on a wave of public support. Cromwell's body was disinterred and his head stuck on a pole at Tyburn. At the Restoration, Lucy Hutchinson persuaded the new regime to spare her husband's life for his role as a regicide. He died in prison. She survived him by some years and wrote his biography to justify his actions. Edward Hyde became Chancellor to Charles II and was ennobled as the Earl of Clarendon, but he later fell out with his new master and spent the rest of his life in exile, where he completed his history of the Civil War. John Lilburne died in 1657, a prisoner in Dover Castle. It would be nearly 300 years before England achieved the democratic rights he had fought so hard for.
Long after war thundered out, long live the cause was the shout of the soldiers in the army, in England and all across the sea. The cause was heightened right here. No food and a lack of good beer, no pennies for them that won. Just promises that some would come. And it's England's freedom, soldiers' rights. Look to the men in your sights. And it's England's